The rancher's name was John Malone, a man of solitude living on the edge of civilization in the heart of Montana. His ranch, nestled in the shadow of towering pine-covered hills, had been his family's legacy for generations. The December snowstorms were fierce this year, but nothing could prepare John for the blizzard that would change his life forever. John wasn't one to complain. He found peace in the quiet of his ranch, the rhythmic crunch of snow underfoot, the crackle of a fire in his stone hearth. But lately, the loneliness gnawed at him more than usual. His wife, Ellen, had passed 5 years ago, and their only son, Matt, had moved to the city. John buried himself in tending to the ranch, his cattle, and his old border collie, Rusty. On this particular evening, the wind howled like a wolf pack, rattling the wooden shutters of his cabin. Rusty barked nervously, his ears perked toward the door. "What's the matter, boy?" John asked, setting down his mug of coffee. The dog's barking grew more urgent, and then John heard it, faint cries carried on the wind, barely audible above the storm. Grabbing his coat, boots, and a flashlight, John stepped out into the blizzard. The icy wind hit him like a slap, cutting through his layers. The cries grew louder as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the barn. "Hello? Is someone out there?" he called, his voice lost in the wind. The sound led him to the edge of his property, near a cluster of snow-covered trees. What he found made him freeze in his tracks. There, huddled together in a pitiful pile, were 8 bear cubs, their fur matted with ice, their tiny bodies trembling violently. Their mother was nowhere in sight. John's heart sank. He'd seen abandoned cubs before, but never so many. The odds of survival for even one cub in this weather were slim, let alone 8. But leaving them out here was not an option. He removed his coat and wrapped as many as he could carry, then sprinted back to the cabin, with Rusty leading the way. Once inside, John stoked the fire until it roared. He laid the cubs near the hearth, gently rubbing their tiny bodies to restore warmth. Their whimpers tore at his heart, each sound a plea for help. Rusty sniffed them cautiously, then lay down protectively beside them. "Where is your mama?" John murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He knew bears didn't abandon their young without reason. Something must have happened to the mother, and the thought filled him with deep sadness. As the hours passed, the cubs began to stir. One by one, they opened their eyes, their small faces filled with fear and confusion. John felt a strange connection to them, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, the blizzard had subsided, leaving the ranch buried under a thick blanket of snow. John woke to the sound of the cubs stirring in the corner by the fireplace, their tiny, curious eyes watching him as he brewed his coffee. Rusty wagged his tail cautiously, keeping a close eye on the newcomers. John's first thought was practical: these cubs couldn't stay here. The ranch wasn't equipped to care for wild animals, let alone 8 bear cubs. He would have to call wildlife services. Yet, as he watched the smallest cub struggle to its feet and tumble into the others, his resolve wavered. They had barely survived the night. What if no one came for them? What if they couldn't be relocated in time? He sighed and opened a can of condensed milk, pouring it into a shallow dish. The cubs sniffed the air, their tiny noses twitching, and soon they were lapping it up greedily. John chuckled despite himself. "Well, you're a hungry bunch, aren't you?" The day was spent improvising. John rigged up a makeshift pen in the corner of the cabin using old wooden crates. He lined it with straw from the barn, making it as warm and comfortable as he could. The cubs huddled together, a tangle of fur and tiny paws, and John felt an unexpected warmth in his heart. As night fell, doubts crept in. What was he thinking? He was no wildlife expert. Taking care of these cubs would be a monumental task, and he was just one man. Yet, as he sat by the fire watching them sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had come to him for a reason. "Maybe I need you as much as you need me," he whispered. Over the next few days, John fell into a new routine. His mornings started with feeding the cubs and cleaning their bedding, a task that was quickly becoming chaotic. They were growing bolder, exploring the cabin with clumsy curiosity. Rusty, ever patient, acted as their unofficial babysitter, nudging them back to their pen when they wandered too far. John began to notice their individual personalities. The largest cub, whom he nicknamed Max, was the leader of the group, always the first to investigate new things. The smallest, a runt he called Daisy, was shy and often clung to her siblings for comfort. Then there was Jasper, who had a knack for getting into trouble, and Bella, who seemed to enjoy curling up in John's lap whenever she could. One evening, as the cubs played by the fire, John found himself smiling more than he had in years. The cabin, once so quiet and lonely, was now filled with life. Yet the reality of their situation loomed over him. He couldn't keep them forever. They were wild animals, and eventually, they would need to return to the wilderness where they belonged. But for now, they were his responsibility, and he was determined to give them a fighting chance. It was a clear, cold morning when the first real challenge arose. John was out checking on his cattle when he heard Rusty barking frantically back at the cabin. His heart raced as he ran back, fearing the worst. When he burst through the door, he found the cubs in a panic. Daisy, the smallest, was lying on her side, her breath shallow and labored. John's hands shook as he scooped her up, her tiny body limp in his arms. "Hang on, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice cracking. He grabbed his old veterinary kit, a relic from the days when his wife had cared for the ranch animals. He examined Daisy, his mind racing. She had a fever, likely an infection. John worked tirelessly, administering antibiotics and keeping her warm. The other cubs watched silently, huddled together as if they understood the gravity of the situation. Rusty lay beside Daisy, his head resting gently on her side. For 2 days, John barely slept, constantly checking on Daisy. When she finally opened her eyes and let out a weak but determined squeak, he felt an overwhelming wave of relief. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said, tears in his eyes. The ordeal brought John closer to the cubs. They weren't just a responsibility anymore, they were family. As the days turned into weeks, the cubs began to thrive. They grew stronger, their fur glossier, their eyes brighter. John's cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home filled with laughter, chaos, and warmth. News of John's unusual houseguests spread through the small town. Neighbors came by with donations of food and supplies, curious to see the cubs. Some offered to help, but John was cautious. He didn't want the cubs to become a spectacle. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Rusty at his feet and the cubs playing nearby, John reflected on how much his life had changed. The loneliness that had weighed on him for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. But he knew this was just the beginning. The cubs' future was uncertain, and the challenges ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Still, as he watched them tumble and play, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As word of John's unusual companion spread, a local wildlife biologist named Dr. Emily Carter paid a visit to the ranch. Emily was known for her expertise in bear rehabilitation, and she had heard about John's predicament through the town grapevine. Emily arrived on a brisk January morning, her boots crunching over the icy driveway. John greeted her at the door, weary but hopeful. "You must be Dr. Carter," he said, shaking her hand. "Call me Emily," she replied with a warm smile. "I hear you've got your hands full in there." John led her inside, where the cubs were playing near the fireplace. Emily's eyes lit up as she observed them. "They look healthy," she said. "You've done a remarkable job, Mr. Malone." "John," he corrected. "And I've just been doing what I can. They're the fighters." Emily spent the day examining the cubs and offering advice on their care. She explained the challenges of rehabilitating them for release into the wild, emphasizing the importance of minimizing human interaction. "It's going to be tough," she said, "but it's not impossible." For the first time, John felt a glimmer of hope that he might not have to face this journey alone. Emily promised to return with supplies and resources to help prepare the cubs for their eventual release. With Emily's guidance, John began implementing changes to the cubs' care. He built an outdoor enclosure behind the barn, complete with climbing structures and hiding spots to encourage their natural behaviors. The cubs were hesitant at first, but soon they were exploring their new environment with gusto. John also started reducing his direct interaction with them, a painful but necessary step. He missed the way Bella would climb into his lap or how Max would nuzzle his hand, but he knew it was for their own good. Rusty, however, remained a comforting presence for the cubs, bridging the gap between human and animal. One afternoon, as John watched from a distance, he noticed Daisy attempting to climb a tree in the enclosure. She struggled at first, her small paw slipping on the bark, but she persisted. When she finally reached a low branch, she let out a triumphant squeak. John couldn't help but feel proud. Emily's visits became more frequent, and a bond began to form between her and John. They shared stories over cups of coffee, finding common ground in their love for animals and the wilderness. For the first time in years, John felt a connection to someone beyond the ranch. As winter began to thaw, the cubs grew more adventurous. Their playful antics brought joy to John, but also a new set of challenges. One morning, he discovered that Jasper had managed to escape the enclosure. Panic set in as he searched the ranch, calling out for the mischievous cub. Rusty's barking led John to a nearby creek, where he found Jasper stuck in the icy water, shivering and frightened. John waded in without hesitation, the freezing water biting at his legs as he pulled the cub to safety. Back at the cabin, John dried Jasper off and held him close, his heart pounding with fear and relief. "You've got to be more careful, little guy," he murmured. The incident was a stark reminder of how vulnerable the cubs still were. Emily arrived later that day and scolded John for not securing the enclosure properly. "You're doing an incredible job, John, but you can't let your guard down. These cubs rely on you." Her words stung, but John knew she was right. He vowed to be more vigilant. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John heard a noise outside the cabin. Rusty growled low in his throat, his ears perked. John grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the chilly air. To his surprise, he saw a large female bear at the edge of the property, her eyes fixed on the cabin. John's heart raced. Was this the cub's mother? The bear made no move to approach, but her presence was unmistakable. Emily arrived the next morning and confirmed John's suspicion. "It's possible she's been searching for them," she said. "But after all this time, she might not accept them back." The encounter left John conflicted. He wanted the cubs to return to the wild, but he also feared for their safety. Emily suggested a gradual reintroduction, a process that would take time and careful planning. As spring arrived, the cubs continued to grow stronger and more independent. John and Emily worked tirelessly to prepare them for life in the wild, introducing them to new challenges and monitoring their progress. The female bear's visits became more frequent, and John noticed her lingering closer to the enclosure. One afternoon, she approached the fence, sniffing cautiously. The cubs responded with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Emily observed the interaction with a hopeful smile. "This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," she said. John's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sadness. The thought of saying goodbye to the cubs was almost too much to bear, but he knew it was the right thing to do. As the days grew warmer, the time for the cubs' release drew nearer. John found himself cherishing every moment with them, from their playful antics to their quiet naps by the fire. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose. As the days grew longer and the snow began to melt, the female bear, whom John now called Matilda, visited the enclosure almost daily. She would sit near the fence, watching the cubs as they played, her eyes filled with what John could only describe as longing. The cubs, too, began to show signs of recognition. Max was the first to approach the fence, sniffing tentatively at Matilda. Slowly but surely, the others followed suit. Emily encouraged John to remain patient. "This is progress," she said. "She's showing maternal instincts, and the cubs are responding. But we need to be careful, rushing this could end badly." To prepare for the transition, Emily and John decided to expand the outdoor enclosure. They created a gate that could be opened when the time was right, allowing Matilda to enter on her own terms. The process was painstaking, requiring both precision and trust. John couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety every time he thought about letting the cubs go. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, John sat on the porch with Emily. "You think they'll be okay out there?" he asked, his voice heavy with worry. "I do," Emily replied. "They've grown so much, John. You've given them the best possible start. Now it's time to trust nature." That night, John stayed up late, sitting by the fire and watching the cubs sleep. He knew the day of their release was fast approaching, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. The day arrived sooner than John expected. Matilda lingered near the gate, her massive frame a commanding presence. The cubs paced nervously, sensing that something was about to change. John and Emily stood by, watching silently as the gate was opened for the first time. Matilda hesitated at first, sniffing the air cautiously. Then, with a low grunt, she stepped inside. The cubs froze, their tiny bodies quivering with a mix of fear and excitement. Max was the first to approach her, followed by Daisy and the others. Matilda sniffed each of them in turn, her massive paw surprisingly gentle as she nudged them closer. "She's accepting them," Emily whispered, her eyes glistening with emotion. John's heart swelled as he watched the reunion unfold. The cubs seemed to recognize Matilda as their mother, their initial hesitation giving way to playful nuzzles and happy squeaks. Over the next few days, Matilda led the cubs around the enclosure, teaching them how to forage and climb. John and Emily observed from a distance, careful not to interfere. The sight was both heartwarming and bittersweet. John knew he had done his part, but letting go was proving to be one of the hardest things he had ever done. The time had come to release Matilda and the cubs into the wild. Emily had scouted a nearby wildlife reserve, a safe haven where they could thrive without the threat of hunters or human encroachment. The plan was to transport them in a specially designed trailer, but getting them inside was another challenge entirely. With patience and a bit of coaxing, Matilda and the cubs eventually entered the trailer. John stood by the door, his hand resting on the latch. "You'll take care of them, won't you?" he asked Emily, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise," she replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. As the trailer pulled away, John felt a lump rise in his throat. Rusty whined softly at his feet, as if sensing his sorrow. For a long moment, John stood in the driveway, watching the vehicle disappear into the horizon. That night, the cabin felt emptier than it had in months. But as John sat by the fire, he found solace in the knowledge that the cubs were where they belonged. Weeks turned into months, and spring blossomed into summer. The ranch was quiet again, but John found new ways to fill his days. He rebuilt the barn, planted a vegetable garden, and even adopted a stray cat that had wandered onto the property. Rusty seemed to enjoy the company, and John found comfort in the small, simple joys of daily life. Emily visited often, bringing updates about the cubs. "They're doing great," she said one afternoon, showing John photos of the cubs climbing trees and playing in the reserve. "Matilda's teaching them well." John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "They're tougher than I gave them credit for," he said. "I guess they had to bear." The bond between John and Emily deepened over time. What had started as a professional collaboration grew into a close friendship, and perhaps something more. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of hope for the future. One crisp autumn morning, John received an unexpected phone call. A local news station had heard about his story and wanted to feature it. Reluctant at first, John eventually agreed, realizing that sharing his experience could inspire others to care for the natural world. The segment aired a week later, showing footage of the cubs, Matilda, and the incredible journey they had taken together. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people all over the country, praising John for his kindness and courage. John decided to create a video for his YouTube channel, sharing the full story in his own words. He began by sitting on the porch with Rusty at his side, the mountains stretching out behind him. "Hi, everyone," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I'm John Malone, and I want to share a story that changed my life. It's about 8 bear cubs, a blizzard, and how a little kindness can go a long way." As the video concluded, John looked directly into the camera. "If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that we're all connected: humans, animals, the land. We have a responsibility to care for each other. So I'll leave you with this question: what's one small thing you can do today to make the world a better place? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts." The video went viral, touching the hearts of millions. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of kindness and connection, creating a ripple effect of positivity. For John, it was a reminder that even the smallest act of compassion could spark something extraordinary. And as the first snow of the season began to fall, John stood on his porch, watching the world turn white once again. This time, he didn't feel alone. He felt hopeful, knowing that the story of the cubs had left a lasting impact on him, on the cubs, and on the world.